Hello friends, my name is Bintou and welcome back to my channel. So we are in the middle of March, which is Women's History Month. And I thought I would sit down and talk about 5 books on women's history or related to women's history that I've read over the years that I've really enjoyed. I recognize this is a little late because it's March 10th, so we're kind of partway through the month, but that's okay. There's still plenty of time left and March is not the only month for reading about women's history. So I've got a grand total of 5 books here that I have read over the years that I really enjoyed. That I think will be perfect for Women's History Month. The very first one I want to talk about is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. And this book is actually one of my all-time favorite books, not just for women's history, just in general that I've read like in my life. So the author is following this group of girls and it kind of details the length of time from when they started working in the factories to when they were battling things out in the court. So basically in this book, there are these girls, they were called the Shining Girls because they were working in these factories that were using radium as paint during the World War I era, and they were mostly painting watch dials so that they would be able to glow. However, the girls in these factories, because these things were so tiny, they were basically using these tiny paintbrushes that they would then have to put in their mouths to put to a point and then dip in the radium paint and paint the dials, and they were doing this over and over again. So they were ingesting radium as they were working. Now, of course, they didn't know this back then, but we know today that radium is extraordinarily poisonous, very radioactive, and it's gonna lead to some consequences, and that's precisely what happened. So all of a sudden, these girls started falling ill and dying at alarming rates, and they were all coming up with these weird cancers, and some of their jaws were literally disintegrating. And the worst part is that she talks about how these factory owners, they didn't know at first perhaps, but they eventually knew that the radium was the cause of this and that was actually very harmful. But of course, for profit, they did not tell the girls this, and they allowed them to keep working in these very dangerous conditions without any precautions. And eventually the girls try to take these companies to court and get some compensation for the lives lost and ruined by this work. This is, I think, a really important piece of American history when it comes to the battle for workers' rights, especially for women. And that's why I picked this as one of my Women's History Month choices. Next book I want to talk about is Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman. If you've watched my videos for a while now, you've probably seen this book several times because it made my top 20 books of 2020, and I did a vlog on this book as well. This is a very interesting piece of writing as well. First of all, the cover on this book is just absolutely gorgeous. Take a look at that. The woman on this cover is beautiful, and then the cover is just so beautifully done, the color and the texture as well. But anyway, to the actual story. So the focus of this book is actually on Black women in New York and Philadelphia during a period of time, I think it's after the Great Migration, where there's like droves of people that were moving up north for better work opportunities that they couldn't get in the South. And this book basically frames the women that it follows. It follows their lives, and it's framing their lives as experiments. Experiments mostly in how they live their intimate lives. So this includes their family lives as well as their sexual lives. A couple of things that I really like in this book is there is a very clear tracing of line, how a line sort of exists from back then to present day in some of the issues that we're seeing in inner cities, for example. It also touches on what these women are forced to do when they're trying to fight for work that is more suited to them instead of just the domestic work, which was pretty much all that they could get as Black women. Lastly, there's a good chunk of this that is dedicated to 2 laws in particular that affected Black women disproportionately, and that was the Wayward Minors Act and the Tenement Housing Law. 2 laws that I actually didn't really know about until I read this book. And both of these laws were used very heavily in policing the sexual lives of Black women in that time period. This book also does have at least one chapter dedicated to queer and trans women as well. Overall, this was a very, very interesting read. I also listened to the audiobook for this, and that was really well done. The next 2 on my list, I'll talk about them together because they're actually very similar, and that is Half the Sky. This is by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodun, and The Moment of Lift by Melinda Gates. And I say that they're very similar because they tackle very similar topics. And honestly, when I read this one first a couple years ago. Actually, funny enough, I picked this one up because it was recommended from my library for Women's History Month, and I think this was like 2 or 3 years ago. And then I read this one in 2020, and when I read this, I thought a lot of this. And Melinda Gates, even references their book. So you probably don't even need to read both, but they were both good, so I would recommend them both at some point. I'm glad that I read both of them. Half the Sky in particular focuses on the oppression of women in Africa and Asia in particular. The stories in this book are very hard to read, and they are very, very moving. I still remember some of the more grotesque stories that I read in this book, and I read this years ago. I don't know if it's possible to actually get through this book without like crying and feeling for the women that it talks about. And probably the line that had kind of the most impressive impact on me in this book is that these women are mostly being punished for simply being born female and poor in whatever country it is that they live in. The stories in this book touch on sex slavery, child marriage, domestic violence, and also really early childbirth that comes with child marriage and infant mortality. A lot of issues that basically concern themselves with women, and a lot of issues that for the most part aren't an issue in like first world countries. At least they're not as big of an issue. One strength of this book that I enjoyed is by the time you get to the end, there are actually actionable steps that you can take that the authors provide. So it's not just like reading and then walking away and not being able to do anything to help or to do anything with the information that you've been given. And the good thing as well is that a lot of these aren't just like the savior, donate money and forget about it. There are like programs where you are giving women money to start their own businesses so that they can be self-sufficient. And I think that that's really neat. The Moment of Lift, again, very similar in that it is focusing on the stories of poor women of color around the world. She also gets to India as well. So India and Africa, and I believe parts of Asia. I can't exactly remember that part. I think that Half the Sky is more moving, but I think this book gets its point across nonetheless. The focus on this book tends to be more on contraception. And so the goal for Melinda more so in this book is more reproductive rights to women around the world and being able to provide contraception that they can use so that women can choose when to have children and how many children they can have, which tends to lead to more educated women if they're not having, you know, child after child after child, particularly because there's lack of resources for taking care of that many children. And eventually the moms themselves don't want to have any more kids. And some of them talk about that in their stories. Of course, Melinda Gates is the wife of billionaire Bill Gates. And I'm glad that she talks about that because I feel like reading something like this from her perspective could be off-putting for some people. The book does focus more though on the stories of the woman rather than herself. And she does touch on sort of the harm that could come from her as a billionaire providing aid to women and not being aware of what she doesn't know, basically. Because just throwing money at the situation, and again, she talks about this, isn't really the best solution all the time. And last book on this list is Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. And I read this last year as well, in nonfiction November, actually. So Hood Feminism is probably the most narrow focused of all of these because it's got a lot of the author's personal stories as anecdotes in each of the topics that she is talking about. The basic gist of Hood Feminism is basically talking about the feminist movement, in particular in regards to the women that the movement forgot. So basically what she's claiming in this book is that a lot of what is considered feminism, and this is focused in the United States of course, has been more so toward the advancement of white women at the detriment to women of color. One thing I like about this book is her discussion on the intersectionality of gender along with race and socioeconomic status. And so what this book does is it did a really good job of expanding the definition of feminism and feminist movement to include some of the issues that affect people of different races that also happen to be female, or people of different sexual orientations that also happen to be female, or socioeconomic classes, and so on and so forth. And how those issues may not at first sight seem to be feminist issues, but in the end truly are feminist issues because they affect women. They just happen to affect women of color more so than white women. And so this book was great to read, if only for that. It kind of helped expand my definition of what feminism is or what it should be. All right guys, and that's it. Those are my 5 picks for Women's History Month books that I've read over the course of the past several years. Let me know if you have read some of these books or you're hoping to pick some of them up, or if there is a different book that you would recommend for Women's History Month. I look forward to reading them in the comments below. In the meantime, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.